This is Carlos Martinez. He's an international commentator and a writer, and I've seen him previously on YouTube, and I'm incredibly gratified that he's come from London to see us. I've learnt a lot from his output, mainly because it's in accessible language. You don't have to learn all these awful, complicated terms, and he talks common sense, and he talks common sense you can understand.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Linda, for that very generous introduction, albeit now I'm under a lot of pressure to talk in intelligible language, which I hadn't been planning on. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming out tonight. It's great to meet you all. Great to talk about such a vital and urgently necessary subject, which is the crisis that Cuba currently faces, which I think is fair to say the most severe crisis that Cuba has faced in modern history since the Cuban Revolution in 1959. And Cuba's faced a lot of crises in that time, but I think this is the most severe one. And the background to it is obviously the blockade against Cuba, which has been imposed by the United States for 63 years. It's the longest running embargo in modern history, and it's been in a process of more or less constant escalation. So it was escalated very severely from 1996 when the US passed the Helms-Burton Act, which incredibly applies extraterritoriality to US laws. So they will penalize any country or company in a different country that does business with Cuba. And, this is an act of economic warfare. It's flagrantly illegal. There's no basis for that in international law. There's literally no other country in the world that attempts to apply extraterritorial sanctions. But that is what the US has been doing for the last 30 years. It's been estimated that the cumulative cost to Cuba of the blockade has been over $160 billion, which adjusted to today's money amounts to about $2 trillion. And given that Cuba's GDP is 80 billion, that's 25 years of the country's GDP, which is an incredible sum. And the purpose of this is to destroy the revolution by making life intolerable, unbearable for ordinary Cuban people. And it affects all aspects of life, right? It affects transportation, it affects schools, it affects hospitals, it affects manufacturing, it affects medicines, it affects paper. Cuba has a shortage of paper, which is a very cruel thing for a nation of book readers, right? Cuba had a reputation for many decades as being the center of book production in Latin America. Now, due to shortages, due to the blockade, it's not able to produce many books. During COVID, Cuba's got such an advanced medical biotechnology industry that it produced its own vaccines. The vaccines it produced were some of the best in the world. It produced them, it vaccinated its own people before nearly all the Western countries. It donated vaccines to other countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, but they didn't have enough syringes to complete the vaccination program at home, and they couldn't import those syringes due to the blockade. And as I said, this blockade is something that continues to escalate. So in the 1980s, Cuba was added to the state sponsors of terrorism list. And the idea of that is that it blocks Cuba's access to the global financial system. It prevents it from doing trade in dollars. So it makes even basic trade, imports and exports, extremely difficult. And Cuba is listed on that alongside Iran, Syria, and North Korea. Syria is a kind of beautiful irony because, of course, Syria was put on the list when it wasn't a state sponsor of terrorism. Now that a US-sponsored Al-Qaeda group has come to power, I'm sure it will be removed from the state sponsors of terrorism list. But there you go. Obama in 2015, as part of a very brief diplomatic tour, removed Cuba from the state sponsors of terrorism list, But Trump relisted Cuba at the end of his term in January 2021 as a kind of spiteful act. Biden kept it there for 4 years until like the last 2 or 3 days of his own term, when he decided, okay, well, I've been useless for 4 years. Let me do one nice thing. So he delisted Cuba, and then Trump immediately, after getting into office, relisted Cuba on the state sponsors of terrorism list. So Cuba enjoyed about a week in January 2025 where it wasn't on this list. And, like Trump doing that in 2021 was another example of kind of turning the screws, like kicking Cuba while it was down, while it's still rebounding from COVID, while it's still rebounding from the fact that, tourism was basically wiped out by the pandemic, by lockdown. In the 90s, in the 2000s, in the 2010s, tourism was a hugely important part of the Cuban economy. And from 2020 onwards, that was basically wiped out. So the US regime decided that, okay, Cuba's suffering, we'll make it suffer more. Let's see if we can't destabilize this to such an extent. And, very similar to what they did in Venezuela when Hugo Chavez died and the prices of commodities collapsed. So Venezuela was facing economic difficulties, and the US decided now is the time to make those difficulties really serious. People are living not so well. Let's make their lives terrible. Which brings us on to Venezuela and what's happened, because the situation with the blockade was more or less manageable up until the 3rd of January 2026, when American armed forces invaded Caracas, invaded Venezuela, and killed over 100 people, including 40 Cuban members of President Maduro's presidential guard, and kidnapped Maduro and kidnapped his wife, the first combatant, Celia Flores. And in the negotiations that followed that, have basically said to Venezuela, if you continue to supply oil to Cuba, then there's going to be further military aggression. There's going to be further invasions. Cuba and Venezuela have had exceptionally good relations since 1999, since the start of the Bolivarian Revolution, since Chavez's first presidency. And those were very much cultivated by the historic leaders of both countries, Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro. At its height, there was about 100,000 barrels of oil being shipped every day from Venezuela to Cuba, which basically met Cuba's energy needs completely. And in return, Cuba was providing doctors in their thousands, teachers in their thousands, providing extensive support to Venezuela's social programs, which of course succeeded in drastically transforming the lives of ordinary Venezuelans, and particularly working class Venezuelans. So those relationships have come to an end as of the last couple of months. And my suspicion is that the rationale for attacking Venezuela, the rationale for kidnapping Maduro, the rationale for cutting off oil flows from Venezuela to Cuba is at least partly based on destabilizing Cuba and making life impossible in the island. Mexico then stepped in January as the main supplier of oil to Cuba, but Trump then threatened Mexico and other countries with tariffs and other punitive actions unless they cancelled their shipments, which Mexico has sadly been forced to do, although it is still sending humanitarian aid of various forms. So the fuel imports to Cuba are now down to zero. As far as I know, there's been no oil or gas has reached the island since December. The Russians have said, thankfully, that they're going to continue supplying oil to Cuba and that they'll send their tankers. And if the US wants to try and attack Russian tankers, well, good luck with that. But that's a pretty dangerous game to play. But I don't think those tankers have reached Cuba yet. So Cuba's suffering a serious energy crisis. It's facing blackouts of up to 20 hours per day in some regions, and the resulting food shortages and the resulting fuel shortages. And just to give a bit of a picture of what that looks like in terms of people's everyday lives, I've got a quote from a Cuban hairdresser who was speaking to Medea Benjamin of the Women's Peace Organization, US Peace Organization, Code Pink, who said, You can't imagine how it touches every part of our lives. With no gasoline, buses don't run, so we can't get to work. We have electricity only 3 to 6 hours a day. There's no gas for cooking, so we're burning wood and charcoal in our apartments. It's like going back 100 years. And on top of this, Caribbean countries and other Latin American countries are being forced to end their medical cooperation agreements with Cuba. Just announced a few days ago that Jamaica's ending its medical cooperation agreement with Cuba under immense pressure from the Trump regime. And this is one of Cuba's main ways of generating income and generating foreign exchange, and it has been for decades. Cuban doctors, Cuban nurses have treated literally millions of Jamaicans and saved literally tens of thousands of lives. But because Trump has decided, and his flunky Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, have decided that Cuba has to starve, then that's all being put a stop to. What is the end game here? What is the US regime trying to achieve? Trump has pretty openly stated that he wants to bring down the Cuban government. He wants regime change. He's talked about getting rid of the Cuban government by the end of this year. And Marco Rubio is obviously kind of the ideological driving force of that. He's a Cuban American. His parents were, I believe, pro-Batista, pre-revolutionary dictatorship Cuba. And his base is kind of reactionary Miami Cubans. And he's someone who's obviously got designs on the presidency. So bringing down Cuba, achieving regime change in Cuba, doing what the Americans really want to do to Cuba, which is to turn it into another Epstein Island. Now that's their model for the Caribbean, right? To turn it into another Little St. James. If he can achieve that, then that's great for his political career. The problem for the US is that they don't have support within the country. Cubans are very solid. They're by and large united behind their government, certainly behind the idea of protecting the country's independence and their sovereignty. So the US currently seems to be working on the basis of trying to soften up certain members of the government and move towards a soft coup type of scenario whereby they can impose their conditions on the Cubans in exchange for not carrying out armed aggression. As I say, they want to turn it into another Epstein Island. They want to turn it into what it was before 1959, which is a US-backed dictatorship with extreme inequality, rampant racism, ties to organized crime. It was essentially an apartheid colony of the United States. Cuba had apartheid before 1959 as much as South Africa did. Cuba also happens to contain the world's third largest cobalt reserves, which is a key material for batteries and other advanced technology. And meanwhile, the Iran war has been going on for 2 weeks now, another criminal, disgusting war being waged by Israel and the US. They expected that to be a big win. Trump clearly thought that they could eliminate Ali Khamenei and take out a few top members of the government, and the people would rise up and they'd achieve regime change in Iran, and he would be able to present that as a big victory. That is manifestly not going how they expected it to go and is turning into a quagmire. So Trump may well be looking to Cuba now for the next big win. And Lindsey Graham, the crazed senator from South Carolina, has said, he was on Fox News a couple of days ago saying that, following the strikes on Iran, Cuba's next. Cuba has responded, predictably, in a very dignified way. President Diaz-Canel has said, Cuba is a free, independent and sovereign nation. No one tells us what to do. Cubans are ready to defend the homeland to the last drop of our blood. But, it's an extremely precarious situation. The energy blockade is devastating. The US is trying to finish off this revolution while it's at a very vulnerable point. The regime change agenda is explicit and it's aggressive, and Cuba's survival is at stake. So I just wanted to talk about why they hate Cuba so much. What makes Cuba so important that, the US has to take this small, economically pretty marginal island and target it for regime change And the other side of that coin is, why is it so important to us? Why should we defend it? It's a largely ideological thing for the US. So Cuba represents the threat of the good example. You've got a small, formerly colonized Caribbean nation, 90 miles from Miami, 90 miles from the United States, which has dared to pursue its own development path, which has dared to assert that another world is possible, that has dared to control its own development, its own resources, and that's an internationalist country that's consistently aligned itself with the forces of progress of the world, with the forces against oppression. That's its crime. It's a good example, and therefore it has to be made an example of. And the achievements of Cuban socialism are nothing short of extraordinary. Obviously, very famously, they've made incredible progress on education and literacy. In 1959, the literacy rate was around 70%. Within 1 year of the Cuban Revolution, the literacy, as a result of their literacy campaign, literacy had reached 96%. And now it's 99.8%, which is significantly higher than it is here in Britain and way higher than it is in the United States. There's free education at every level, including university and including adult education. Cuba's ranked 16th in UNESCO's Education for All Index, which is higher than any other country in the Americas, including the US. They've got a maximum of 25 pupils per class. They have free school meals for everyone, free uniforms for everyone. So it's a very moral and dignified education system that genuinely aims to increase people's level of knowledge and understanding and wisdom and culture. Cuba is very famous for its healthcare. It's got free, universal, and exceptionally high-quality healthcare. 1 doctor for every 220 people, which is one of the highest ratios in the world. England, by the way, has one per 370. Its life expectancy is 79, which is higher than many far wealthier countries, including the United States. Its infant mortality rate is 5 deaths per 1,000 live births, much better than the US, vastly better than the Latin American average, which is 27. It's got the lowest HIV prevalence rate in the Americas. It developed the world's first vaccine against meningitis B. As I mentioned earlier, it developed its own vaccines, Sobadana 2 and Abdala, against COVID-19. And despite the blockade, it was able to carry out a mass vaccination campaign. Cuba is one of the world's very few, it's the small handful of actively anti-racist states. As I mentioned before, pre-revolutionary Cuba was an apartheid society. You had racial segregation in work, in parks, in education. On the beaches, Afro-Cubans were restricted to the worst jobs, the worst housing, the worst education. And Cuba's made, really profound progress. Isaac Staining, who's a Canadian expert on Cuban matters, argues that Cuba's done more than any other country to dismantle institutionalized racism and generate racial harmony. And this is something that was echoed by Assata Shakur, who was African-American freedom fighter who was framed, imprisoned as part of the Black Panthers and the Black Liberation Army in the late 1970s, broke out of prison, and then sought exile in Cuba and remained in Cuba for the rest of her years and until dying last year. She said that the revolution was totally committed to struggling against racism and sexism in all their forms. This was and continues to be very important to me. And on the subject of women's rights and gender justice, 43% of Cuba's parliamentarians are female. 64% of university places are occupied by women. The 2022 Family Code is one of the most progressive family law frameworks in the world. It legalized same-sex marriage. It recognized diverse family structures. And it's a really interesting example of socialist democracy as well, because it was carried out, it was developed on the basis of a mass consultation process over the course of several months, involving literally millions of people, and then put to a referendum, which, it was passed by referendum with 67% in favor, with a 74% turnout. So this is, it's an interesting model of socialist democracy in action, where the state is leading on social progress through popular participation. Another thing Cuba is extremely famous for is its internationalism. it's, that's a legendary part of Cuba, right? Arguably, you could say that it's the most internationalist, radically internationalist country in history, with a foreign policy that is firmly rooted in solidarity and anti-imperialism, and is carried out with incredible selflessness. I mean, all countries base their foreign policy to some degree on realpolitik. That's a simple fact of life. But you can say that less about Cuba than you can say about any other country. Cuba deployed 375,000 troops to Angola and Namibia between 1975 and 1991. And it's considered to have had a decisive role in defeating the South African apartheid forces, in liberating Namibia, and in preserving Angolan independence, such that Nelson Mandela, when he visited Cuba in 1991, and it was the first country outside of Africa that he did visit after being released from prison, Mandela said, "The Cuban internationalists have made a contribution to African independence, freedom, and justice unparalleled for its principled and selfless character. It's unparalleled in African history to have another people rise to the defense of one of us." And 2,000 plus Cubans gave their life in that struggle, fighting for African liberation. And the Cuban-led victory at Quito Carnivale in Namibia, or what was then in Angola, is what forced South Africa to the negotiating table. And without it, the apartheid regime could still very well exist today, just like an apartheid regime still exists in Israel. And it's actually the largest military engagement in Africa since World War II. Cuba also sent troops and support to Guinea-Bissau, Algeria, Guinea, Congo, Ethiopia, Western Sahara, South Yemen, Mozambique, Grenada, and Nicaragua in their revolutionary and national liberation movements. Cuba provided very important support to Vietnam during the war, mainly in the form of doctors and teachers, while the US was bombing it. And Fidel Castro was the only head of state in the entire world to visit the liberated zones in South Vietnam during the war. Another thing that's very famous about Cuba is its medical internationalism, and the fact that while the US's major export is bombs and weapons of mass destruction and the forces of death, Cuba's major export is, and has for a very long time been, doctors. 400,000 Cuban medical personnel have served in 164 countries over the course of the revolution. Approximately 25,000 Cuban healthcare workers are currently active in around 60 countries. The Latin American School of Medicine in Havana may very well be the world's largest medical school, and it offers free or low-cost medical training to students from Africa, the Caribbean, and Latin America on the condition that they return home after their medical degree to serve their communities. Cuba has also long been a major innovator in sustainable development and environmental protection, such that the World Wildlife Federation declared Cuba to be the only country in the world to have achieved sustainable development, meaning that they've got both a high Human Development Index and environmental sustainability. It's a world leader in urban organic farming, and Havana's organic farms supply 100% of the city's fruit and vegetables. Its solar energy transition is now underway at a remarkable pace. And Fidel Castro was one of the earliest and the most vocal heads of state in relation to environmental protection and environmental justice. And Fidel actually spoke and gave a very impassioned, fiery speech at the 1992 Rio Summit, which was the first time when there was established a kind of international consensus, a global consensus around the dangers of climate change and the possibility of climate breakdown. And Fidel placed the blame for the climate crisis exactly where it belonged, i.e. with the advanced capitalist countries. So, Cuba is a country of human dignity, regardless of what one thinks, what criticisms one might have of it. It's a country of human dignity, a country without homelessness, a country where nobody starves, a country where nobody is deprived of healthcare, a country where nobody is deprived of education. And you can compare that with other countries in the region, with Haiti, with the Dominican Republic, with Honduras, with Guatemala, with Belize, etc., the income disparity is exceptionally low. It's an exceptionally safe society. You can be a young woman out at 3 a.m. in central Havana and you're completely safe. Nothing's going to happen to you. So there's a lot to defend in Cuba. What's going to happen now? Great question. Cubans are extraordinarily resilient. They've survived a lot of crises. They've survived the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, Operation Mongoose, and literally hundreds of CIA assassination attempts against Fidel Castro and other leaders. They survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, which wiped out 85% of Cuba's foreign trade overnight. They got creative. They established what they call the special period in the 1990s. They introduced tourism. It was an extremely difficult time. People suffered. People ate less than they had been eating. But they got through it without capitulating to capitalism, without any kind of mass starvation, and without submitting themselves to the Washington Consensus, without submitting themselves to neoliberalism, without subjecting themselves to IMF loans and austerity. So they displayed remarkable resilience, remarkable creativity, and they're going to continue to do that. Cuba's now responding creatively to the oil siege. The response is very much not surrender, but it's transformation. And the most important part of which is the solar energy revolution. Cuba has tripled its solar power generating capacity in the course of the last year. It's gone from just under 6% to now over 20% of total electricity generation. 49 new solar parks have been connected to the grid, such that it's one of the fastest renewable energy transitions ever achieved by a developing country. The goal is to get to between 30 and 35% renewable by the end of this year, which they will achieve if the current pace is maintained. And, China's been absolutely essential to this progress in solar energy. China's providing the equipment, the financing, and the expertise for that. It's also donated 10,000 photovoltaic systems for isolated homes and for critical facilities like maternity wards. China's also approved $80 million in emergency financial aid for electrical equipment and donated, in the course of the last couple of weeks, 60,000 tons of emergency rice aid. And this chimes with the relations that have been building between the two countries over the last few decades, encapsulated in Fidel Castro's quote from 2004, that China has objectively become the most promising hope and the best example for all third world countries. Regarding Russia, as I say, the oil supplies hopefully continue. That's been confirmed by the Russian ambassador to Cuba. But we need broader international solidarity. Cuba needs everyone's solidarity. As Asata Shakur said, imperialism is an international system of exploitation, and we need to be internationalists to defeat it. Fidel Castro, a long time ago, 30 years ago, put forward his opinion on what the impact of the loss of Cuba would be. He said, "We understand what it would mean for all the progressive forces, all the revolutionary forces, for all the lovers of peace and justice in the world, if the United States succeeded in crushing the Cuban Revolution." The crushing of the Cuban Revolution would embolden imperial aggression everywhere. It would send a message that no country can defy global capitalism and survive. It would be a historic setback for the global working class, a loss of 67 years of socialist construction, and what I would argue is, the world's most extraordinary example of revolutionary internationalism. So what does that solidarity look like here in Britain? Well, one thing that people can and should do is join Cuba Solidarity Campaign, which organizes events, delegations, campaigns, fundraising, and raises awareness. We should be organizing against the blockade. I think, by and large, people don't know about the blockade. The media ignores the blockade. So challenging that is in itself a political act. We should counter negative propaganda against Cuba, including from the left. There are left organizations that say, well, we don't support war against Cuba. We don't support Trumpian regime change against Cuba. But Cuba's pretty bad, isn't it? It's the Stalinist dictatorship, it's state capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not the sort of line that's going to win people over to the notion of defending Cuba. We need to build links with Cuba, with trade unions, with professional bodies, faith communities. We can be sending material aid, and it's great that people have meetings like this where we're fundraising in a tangible way for Cuba. Cuba needs medicine, Cuba needs equipment, Cuba needs basic supplies, and we can help with all of that. And at a ideological and a political level, we can help to connect the dots. We can recognize that the same ruling classes that impose austerity and inequality and poverty on us here in the West is the same ruling class that's waging economic warfare against Cuba. It's the same ruling class that's bombing Iran right now. It's the same ruling class that's sponsoring a genocide in Gaza right now. It's the same ruling class that's attacking Venezuela. The struggle for Cuba is part of that same global struggle. So defending Cuba is defending the proposition that humanity can build a world based on solidarity, justice, and human dignity rather than profit, empire, and war. Thank you.